Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking of Sundara, where I talk about Sundara Dawn of a New Age, my fantasy RPG setting. This week, I'm very excited, as we've had our first release for Sundara since the OGL kerfuffle earlier this year. And part of that is because it takes time for these things to get through, and part of it is I wanted to make sure we picked a good one for coming back after all of that nonsense. For folks who maybe weren't around for that part of things, it takes about a month or two for things to be completed on my end and then to come out from the publisher. So if you've been waiting around wondering if the setting is going to be put on a shelf somewhere, I still have ideas. I'm planning on still releasing stuff. It's just going to take a bit since we sort of pivoted to new things while Wizards was making up its mind, and we're just now getting back into the flow. But last month, Guilds of Sundara came out, and it's one that I've been pretty excited about. I had a lot of fun putting together. And I figured rather than just going page by page, item by item, like I did with Species of Sundara or with Cities of Sundara, what I'd do is I'd kind of highlight some of my favorites and talk about where this kind of fits into the whole world building that I've been doing so far, and what I think players and game masters could get out of it. Also, apologies for all of the natural light in my room, but I woke up early and decided to get things done. So, what do you get with Guilds of Sundara? Like lots of the stuff we've been getting in what I'm nominally calling Phase 3 of the setting, Guilds gives you 10 separate organizations. Each organization has history, notable NPCs, some things that it's done, some rumors about it that you can use either as hooks for antagonists or as allies and paymasters. But you can also get a feat for each one. For D&D 5e, it's a regular feat. For Pathfinder, it's actually a story feat, which I have really enjoyed, and I feel they've been kind of underutilized because it's difficult to work all of them in, but I figured that if you have an entire group that's trying to join a guild, or at least trying to become higher up in a guild, that gives game masters a little bit of a hook, and it helps make plotting and planning easier for you, particularly when it comes to player motivation. As to which of the guilds I most enjoy and I think that folks would really like to check out, I've earmarked a couple of them I'd like to talk about. The first, both in the collection and the first one I want to talk about, is the Landers Guild, and if they sound familiar to anyone who picked up Cults of Sundara, they're the nominal antagonists in the introductory story on Little Cat Feet. For those who haven't heard about it, or who want to listen to it, there's the audio drama version on the channel, go check that out. But the story involves the followers of Barast, which is a cat cult of assassins, who want the Landers Guild off their property. So I figured I would expand that with this particular book. And the Landers Guild is basically what it says on the tin of they're a guild of landlords. But they're also more and less than that. I've mentioned the Firan Empire several times throughout these books, of their sort of Sundara's Rome. They collapsed a few centuries ago due to corruption, internal strife, but they've left a lot of marks behind. There's a lot of architecture, there's a lot of spells, there's a lot of philosophy, all of these things still roaming about, and some of it has led to interesting changes. We'll see this again for other entries. The Landers Guild started as the last remnants of the old nobility, the aristocracy, the landed gentry, and they wanted to avoid all of the strife that came with the revolution, all of the peasants who were rising up against those who had been notably corrupt in power, but they wanted to keep all of their land, all of their privilege. And so we see something not dissimilar to what happened after the French Revolution, of you see lots of nobles suddenly writing, well, nobles and former nobles, writing treatises on economic philosophy. And this is kind of how capitalism came about. It was a way for those who had traditionally had land, power, and privilege to keep all of that while pretending they were no longer nobles, so that it would sort of assuage the anger of the lower classes against them, because now everything was quote-unquote fair, as long as you started with all of the right advantages. And the Landers Guild is one of those that could go either way, of none of these organizations are entirely good, none of them are entirely evil, because they're made up of people. And so, some people will be more corrupt than others, some will be more ideal than others. And the Landers Guild can work really well as antagonists, but they can also work really well as allies if they're trying to reclaim an area that's been polluted, if they're attempting to provide a service for people rather than just control a plot of land and squeeze the people living on it for all the money they can get out of them. But moving on from the Landers Guild, we have a bit of a double entry. I wanted to expand some of the existing lore that we had and add to some of the things from Phase 1, which was the Cities of Sundara books. And so we have two guilds that are connected to previous cities specifically, because a few of them had been mentioned along the way. We have the Dragon Forgers, who come from Ironfire, the very first entry that we had in really the whole setting. And as the name implies, they're the ones who run the Dragon Forge, which is where all of the dragon steel is made, which for folks who are not familiar with it, maybe you haven't been with us since episode 1 of the channel, but dragon steel is sort of pattern welded steel. It's a closely kept industrial secret, but it is also produced en masse. It's where Ironfire makes all of its money. It's where most of its prestige comes from. It's where this one material is made and shipped out to the rest of the setting. And the Dragon Forgers are the alchemists, the steel workers. They're the ones who know how it works. They're the ones who've been trained, and they're the ones who keep the secrets. And on the other end of it, from Silkgift, the City of Sails, which is a place of mad science, invention, strange alchemical ideas that, push the boundaries of reality, we have the Dredgers. In Silkgift, it's most known for its colossal canal that it dug through miles and miles and miles of mountains, taking this out-of-the-way place that got occasional visitors, but wasn't really a huge port city, and making it a huge port city by giving everyone who heard of this canal a safer, easier, faster route to bypass a lot of dangerous coastline, a lot of difficult storms, things of that nature, for a small fee that was practically guaranteed to get you where you wanted to go. And so the dredgers are the ones who maintain the canal, who ensure that new branches of it are added, that nothing falls apart. And it kind of brings in a lot of smaller towns that I've mentioned in other settings, like the Towns of Sundara book. And it gives you a bit of an umbrella to just bring more stuff in. And they act as kind of a counterweight to other things that have been mentioned in Silkgift. There's the ingenieurs and various other aspects of that city. So it gives you more things to throw in if you like Silkgift and you want to have your players, going around in that area. You just want them from Silkgift, and you want to, have them going out and studying other architectural methods, other things people are doing in different places. But beyond the dredgers, we have 2 more entries, and then I'll end it. So folks who want to see the rest of the book, still have a few surprises left. But the one that I really enjoyed, which we also have introduced in the intro fiction of this book, is the Manhunters Guild. And they are very much what it says on the tin of they are bounty hunters extraordinaire. And sometimes they're seen as a positive force, like when they go out and round up bandits and bring them in to face justice for their crimes, particularly since Sundara is such a scattered setting as far as power structures go. I've mentioned it before, but there's no nations, countries, anything quite so grand. You have towns, you have cities, you have regional alliances. Occasionally you'll find a city-state if some large population center rises to a state of power. But there's nothing so grand or broad as an empire, at least at this point in time in the setting, especially since the Fearan Empire has fallen and never quite been rebuilt. We'll get to that in a moment. But the Manhunters also have a bit of a reputation for working for some people they shouldn't, and bringing home folks who are not, in fact, criminals, whether it's runaway children or some have rumored that they've run down escaped slaves. They don't take kindly to that kind of talk. They're not saying they didn't do it, they just don't like it when people talk about it. But the Manhunters have a very interesting origin story in that after the Fearan Empire fell, there was a power vacuum, and lots of folks attempted to step in and take it. One of those was a very authoritarian regime who attempted to foster strength through hatred, and they started gathering interesting allies, you might say, amongst the smaller towns that had been left without a government, that had sort of been left adrift. They didn't know who to answer to. They no longer had the protection of the garrison they'd been given by the former empire, and they were looking for someone to keep them safe. This led to a bunch of folks in red hoods going around and throwing interesting-looking salutes. The Manhunters were born from the end of this group. Once they had been opposed, they had been scattered to the winds. There were a lot of people who wanted justice for the things that they had done, and the Manhunters were those who tracked them down. In this case, their origin story is sort of similar to what we see of the Nazi hunters after the end of World War II, who were going out trying to find where all these war criminals had gone, either what country they had fled to, what new name they had tried to take up residence under. And so there's always an undercurrent, among the Manhunters Guild of, because this is a fantasy setting and people can live for a really long time, there may still be some of those original members of, the Red Hand, I believe they were called. And that is actually one of the ways that you complete the story feed. If you can bring at least one of them back, you're in. That's all they consider good enough of you did the really difficult task. It's not the only way, but if it's a much simpler way if you're looking for just number of targets to declare yourself a member of the guild. And lastly, we have the Blood, who sort of fills a bunch of the niches I've talked about thus far for the other guilds that I've mentioned. The Blood, as the name might imply, is a guild of sorcerers. They're not a direct reference to the X-Men, but there is a bit of that spirit in there of they go out and they try to find burgeoning sorcerers or those who are mostly self-taught who could use a little extra refinement, and they give them a safe place to learn, and they attempt to assuage the fears of the populations. It's a thing that has been mentioned several times in the setting up till now, particularly in Archbliss, the City of the Sorcerers, that sorcerers don't have the greatest reputation in Sundara, partially because they are very powerful, but also because historically there has been a fear of those with power that no one can control. There's not a deity giving it to them. There's not a government who is stamping them. They don't have to go through any kind of training session for either a guild or a monastic order or something like that. And so there's just these wild, untapped sources that can be very unpredictable. And that doesn't help when sorcerers are met with that kind of fear and mistrust. It can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Blood is also connected to Archbliss as far as a historical setting goes. They were originally sent out by the floating City of the Sorcerers as kind of talent scouts and headhunters. They would find new sorcerers and give them back to the city for training. But a little while back, they started getting suspicious that the city was not actually acting in good faith as far as these new sorcerers were concerned, rather than the mission they were told they had, which was to find people who were afraid, who were scared, who didn't know what was happening to them. They were pretty sure the city was just taking them and using them for their own ends, which isn't entirely correct. They might have been thrown into the black cells that act as basically power conduits to keep the city flying. They may have been used as cat's paws, being taken by some of the noble houses and made to do the dirty work. And so we ended up with what is called the War of the Blood, which was this soon-to-be guild declaring itself independent from Archbliss and going and doing its own thing. And so we have a bit of a Brotherhood versus the X-Men in the background for folks who like that kind of conflict, and they want to sort of bring that in either as a plot device or as something that can affect the backstory of sorcerers and individuals with bloodline powers, if you're playing Pathfinder, in the background of your game. And it was a lot of fun. I really liked designing them. And I think that the benefit you get from being a member of the Blood is very interesting, because they have a bit of that authority that comes when you're part of an established guild, but there is still that undercurrent of wondering if any of the rumors you've heard about what these people are capable of are true, and if they're actually here to help or not. But that's sort of my sneak peek of Guilds of Sundara. And I have another video I'm planning for a more in-depth topic, but I do have a couple more books I'd like to do for this part of Sundara's releases before I move on to something new or something fresh in the setting. But I wanted to leave today's video with a question for you as the audience who are actually popping in, listening, and I'm assuming, picking up the books when you can. What aspects of the setting would you like to see explored further? Do you want to see new cities? Do you want to see additional towns? Do you want just lists of NPCs? Do you want to see more organizations like I've been doing for Phase 3? Or do you want to see something else entirely? Do you want to see... Adventure paths are a thing I've talked about several times, as well as modules, and it's just one of those of, there have been one or two voices, but it's never really been a demand. So make your voice heard, let me know what you want to see, and leave it in the comments below. Until next time, happy gaming, everyone.